Hello, I'm Jacqueline Bunn.
And my name is Natasha Sarah Lorraine, and this is Legally Speaking.
Historically, Legally Speaking has been a community outreach effort by the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys, but this year we decided to shift focus and try to allow this program to actually be of service to our membership.
And Legally Speaking is brought to you by the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys, otherwise known as GABWA. GABWA is a volunteer bar association that seeks to advocate for women and children and the empowerment of our communities.
Most lawyers are pretty decent writers, and so it's no real surprise that at some point a lot of lawyers decide that they want to become authors. So today our segment is going to focus on how to get a book published and how you can become an author.
And so if you ever thought about writing your own book and the process for publishing your works, this is the episode for you, because this episode will be discussing how to publish a book. We have an accomplished author here with us today to share his motivation behind his authorship and how he was able to publish his novel. Mr. Alonzo Lawrence is a partner with Patel Burkhalter, practicing corporate law, and he has also published his first novel, The Mirror, a political thriller, in 2011, and his second book, The MBE's Guide to Raising Capital, in 2013. Right. Welcome, Mr. Lawrence.
Oh, thank you for having me. Really glad to be here.
Thank you. Alonzo, how did you decide you wanted to write a novel?
That's a great question. Initially, early on in my legal career, honestly, I didn't think about writing, didn't have an interest in it. It really wasn't until you had the likes of John Grisham and other attorneys that decided to write novels and had tremendous success with it, the Pelican Brief, The Firm, and others, that caught my attention. I had a story idea, and there were certain things that I saw at this time while I was in Washington that I wanted to communicate and wanted to do it in an entertaining fashion. So I set a goal for myself and went about it writing the novel.
Wow.
So you made the decision to write a novel. So now what? What is the step from taking it from just a thought to pen to paper?
Sure. I've had this conversation with a number of authors. Living in Washington, one of the benefits is you meet a number of folks that are either in the publishing business and the news business. Correct. Or authors. And each one has his or her own style. So I decided to, because of the genre that I was participating in or writing about, that the best thing for me, and this was my first time, doing it, was to go about putting together an outline first, a very detailed outline, because the more prepared I am, the better I am, and the more comfortable I am telling the story.
Did you take any classes, like any?
No classes, no reading up.
No conferences, because I know there are conferences out there that will allow you to,
Yeah, and I strongly encourage it, because I think for every person, there's a different approach.
Okay.
Certainly in speaking with different authors that have written novels before, it seems as though we all have a different approach, different mentality, and I think they each yield their own benefits. It just really depends on the author.
And so every journey is a little different.
Every journey is a little bit different, and I think each journey also sort of requires a different approach because of the uniqueness of the writing, the type of writing that you're trying to do.
Okay.
And what type of research goes into drafting a novel, like when you're first putting your concept together?
Mm-hmm. The research, I think, depends on the type and the nature of the novel that you're attempting to write. The first novel that I wrote didn't have to do a lot of research. I lived in Washington, had experience in an area that I was writing about. Mm-hmm. You do want your novel to be as accurate and precise as you possibly can. So the novel I'm currently working on, I have had to do a lot more research because it involves more international. Mm-hmm. So I've had to do a lot of research in terms of the scenery, the specifics to street names, the smell, everything about that area. I'm trying to be as precise as you possibly can to make it as realistic as you possibly can.
Now, what is the timeline? How long does it take to draft a book?
To draft a book, and once again, this is another one that I think really depends. Some people will say if you write a page every day, that's a good way to go about it. My first one, I knew that if I didn't go about it and be very precise about the timing and just get it done, I probably wouldn't do it. Because then, for various reasons, work, life, and so forth, you may end up taking longer, and then you say, well, I'll get to it later on. So what I did was set a very definitive schedule in terms of putting together my outline, And from there, I've set a very definitive schedule in terms of I didn't actually write my first draft. I used a dictaphone and told a story. And every day during the weekday, I would do a chapter, and during the weekend, I'd do at least 2 chapters. And over a 3-week period, I had the complete project, done.
And I know, I mean, as a lawyer, you deal with very serious matters or whatever. What made you opt to do a novel instead of something more academic, maybe?
Yeah, the novel, just like now, ideas sort of come to me. And it was an idea that was based in fact, but it was an idea that also allowed me to make some points that I wanted to make, doing it in an entertaining fashion, communicate what I wanted to do, but not preach. That was my goal. Can I tell a story, an entertaining story, make a point, but not preach? That was very important to me. So that was the premise upon which I went about, writing a story. But once again, it really does depend upon the author and what that author wants to achieve through the process.
Now, your first novel, The Mirror, is about the first African-American president, and this was before Barack Obama became president.
It was.
So you were really just envisioning what could be. What inspired this?
Sure. To put a little context around it, I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. I had just finished law school a few years earlier from Howard Law, and I had focused on international law while in law school, international and corporate law. Couldn't decide what area, what discipline I really wanted to go into, so my first job was with the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Honors Program. And that allowed me to do things like international tax, banking and finance, but also I had a chance to rotate through the U.S. Customs Service. And they have most people don't realize the amount of activity that takes place at that time was the U.S. Customs Service. There's a lot of interaction, we'll say, with various intelligence communities. So I was integrated into that world for a bit. So that was sort of the context in which I sort of pursued this particular novel. I had some background, some level of knowledge of what really kind of happens in that world, to a certain extent. So I thought it would be fun to write about it from this perspective, but the overwhelming part of the goal and the desire to write The Mirror in the way I did was I'm a voracious reader of spy novels and political thrillers. I love going to those sorts of movies also, and as I'm sure you know, at least certainly in the, prior to the last 10 years or so, you didn't find a number of African Americans that were lead characters, certainly in that.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. I wanted to kind of break that mold. The second thing was seeing the role that power and politics played in our system, money and power. How important it was, the influence it had, the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. So there were certain things that I wanted to integrate. And then, of course, the third was I wanted to communicate a message to the African American community that we don't realize just how much power we really have.
Absolutely.
Right.
Here's a mechanism to do something. You probably won't agree with the way I approached it in the book in terms of what these people did, and I'm sure you have some questions there. But the message was we have a significant amount of power and we can influence things more than we realize.
Absolutely. What about the motivation behind the MBE's Guide to Raising Capital?
Yeah, that's a great question. After I left I decided that international law, although great, I wanted to pursue corporate law. So once I left the Treasury Department, I then decided to go to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and worked in their division of corporate finance, which is a transactional arm of the SEC. It's where you have your initial public offerings, mergers and acquisitions, and so forth. Initial public offerings are an event. They're more than just a corporate transaction. Initial public offerings are an event because the amount of wealth that's created anytime you have an initial public offering, particularly by the founders, is pretty substantial. And you have not only wealth for that particular person that started the company and those that started the company with it, the officers, but it's a generational type wealth event. And the thing that just blew me away was during the period I was there were no African Americans that took companies public other than Bob Johnson and BET. I'm sure there probably were others, but I wasn't aware of them. Yeah. So I made a promise to myself that once I once I left the SEC and into private practice, I would do any and everything I could to share this knowledge and help minority-owned businesses grow in a going public was the event that was appropriate for them,
They'd have a tool.
they'd have a tool to do so.
Now, let's talk about publishing, because I know probably from our members' perspective, they can write the book, but now, how do we get it out to the public? Did you self-publish, or did you have a publisher for one or both of the books?
Sure. I reached out as a result of relationships I had in Washington to a number of publishers in New York. That was the route that they recommended I take.
Okay.
They came back, reviewed it, and said the plot was not plausible. So
Interesting.
I did that for a
Because
period
it
of
was
time.
an African-American president? Was that what?
Right.
Well, the way it transpired was they said was not a plausible scenario.
Okay.
So I basically left it on the shelf, and soon after that, I entered private practice.
Okay.
And I just put it on the shelf and didn't really think about it. And it wasn't until President Obama was elected that I started getting calls about the book. What happened to that
Yeah.
book you wrote?
Yeah.
Oh,
What are you doing now? So at that point, I didn't have time to really pursue that whole thing about getting an agent again. And I decided to do some research and figure out whether I could self-publish it, because I thought that would be more efficient. I would be the master of my own fate. I could control everything. So I decided to go down that route after researching it.
okay.
And what type of research goes into someone who's interested in self-publishing?
The biggest thing, I think, is one, exploring whether it's best to pursue getting an agent,
Yeah.
right? And determining what agents are in what genres, because you don't want to go to agent A if that agent is in genre A and you're in genre G.
Absolutely.
So you want to do that, and you want to find out, your own research in terms of what the market is absorbing right now, and sort out from there whether this is the right time, because timing is everything in a lot of this, as I found out for sure. Some people feel that it has to happen today, and I learned that patience truly is a virtue. And that timing does play a role in some of this. Now, you can drive it and control it as much as you possibly can, but some of it is outside of your control. But do the research, understand what the market is calling for, understand who is leading in that market, what publishing houses are active in that market, if you want to go down that road. If you want to consider self-publishing, then there are a number of different self-publishing mechanisms that you can use, companies that help in that respect. And each one has its own benefits and detriments, and you really have to sort it through and figure out what's best for you based upon what it is you want to achieve through the publishing process.
I know our members, and the question at the top of their list is it expensive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
What
our
are the
bottom line.
costs?
What are the costs
What are the
associated?
costs?
Yes.
Yeah. Today, that whole issue is evolving. I have spoken with publishers today, Asians, and for example, they now want to know, what have you done on the social media side? So I say that because even
How
with
many
the publisher,
followers do you have?
you
Yeah.
want to begin that whole process
Early.
and do whatever you feel is appropriate to get your name and the product that you have that's out there. In terms of the self-publishing process, each approach can require certain amounts of money. The key thing that I always tell people when they ask about the whole issue of self-publishing and the costs is to sort out, if you're going to use a self-publishing, whether you want to go down the route of having your books printed beforehand, or you go down to print on demand. Now you also have the ebooks and the audio books.
Right.
The approach I took was the print on demand. That saves you money, but you want to make sure that you have a professional group that's making sure that they do all of the publishing in the right way and in a professional manner at the same time.
All right, let's back up a little bit just to make sure that people understand the terminology. When you say publish on demand, how does that work?
Sure. So the publishing house that I went through, the self-publishing house that I went through, depending upon the number of books or the book, it can be just one at a time.
Okay.
So, for example, mine are currently, you can buy mine through either Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So they won't publish until there's an order that comes through.
Okay.
I only paid in terms of the initial phase of the book's printing. So I went through the whole process just as you would with a publishing company with them. They had an editing team. You had the cover. You had all of the components that you would expect to find through a publishing house through the Amazon publishing group that I use. I had a team actually working with me from beginning to end. So it was done in a professional manner, and you took the process from beginning to end. So that meant that all I had to do now, that was the only part that I paid for.
Okay.
And now the only thing that happens if I want to pay money now is if I want my own copies.
Then,
And for example, if I'm going to a conference and I'm speaking at a conference and they want copies of the book, I'll then order my own books and I'll pay for it that way.
what's the turnaround?
Turnaround can be as short as you want it to be. It can be next day if you want it.
Wow.
Wow. So what is some advice you would give to our members who are interested in publishing their books, albeit going through self-publishing or a publishing company?
Sure. I guess I would just adopt the Nike motto and just do it. Just do it. First of all, have faith in yourself. Have faith in yourself. If you have an idea, do it.
Yeah.
Write it. Just talk to people in terms of different approaches, sure. But at the end of the day, write it. Give it your best shot. It's not going to be perfect your first turnaround, but give it your best shot, and things will happen that you probably don't anticipate on a go-forward basis.
For sure. Well, and as I thought about The Mirror, did you even ever have you contemplated that it could become a movie even?
I get that question. There has been movement on that front. And so I get that question
Breaking
a lot.
news.
Yes. You heard it here first, Gabwa.
There's been movement on it. It started and stopped a couple of times.
Okay.
So where it will go, once again, I'll leave it in God's hands. The movie process, thankfully, even though I'm a corporate lawyer, I have experience in the whole movie production business. So I represent some production companies. I've actually had one of my clients actually have a movie go to fruition. So I know that process.
Wonderful.
And, understand what goes into it. So I'm patient on that front. If it's meant to be, it'll be.
And this scene will be in the movie, so we got to figure out who's going to play us.
That's right. Indeed. Oh, well, that's exciting news for you.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
All right. Are there any specific things you would want to share that we haven't covered?
I think that, as I mentioned, the first thing is to make sure that if there is the desire to write, that you do it. Start off, get a draft, talk to different authors, and find out what works best for you. You'll find, particularly for fiction novels, to the point I made earlier, each author has his or her own approach. My approach is plot-driven and build the characters from there. I've talked to other authors where they're character-driven. They have a character and they build the plot around that character. So those sorts of things you can, by talking to other authors, help define and refine your approach, but most importantly, begin. Then begin the research to understand what the market is telling you. When people ask me why didn't I be more aggressive about it in the beginning, and even after I published it, they asked me what my thoughts were and so forth. One of the things I've learned by being a corporate attorney and working with companies at various stages of development is that we tend to not be patient and let the market tell you what you have. So write it. The market will tell you, because people, I used to always say, I have no idea whether this is a piece of garbage or not. And so you can be intimidated by the process. You can be, if you say, well, I'm not good about taking criticism, don't be afraid of it.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid of it. Let it happen, and the market will tell you what you have, but you got to write it first and let everything else fall in place from there.
All right.
Okay. Well, this just about
Wraps us up, yeah.
wraps up our episode of Legally Speaking. Thank you so much
Thank you
for
for
coming
having
and
me.
speaking to
Glad
us
to be
and
here.
providing that insight to our members.
More than
And
happy.
to our members, this is not considered legal advice. That's not the goal here, but we wanted to provide insight to you and allow you to pick the brain of somebody who's done maybe something that you're really aspiring to do. Thank you so much, Alonzo. It's been
my
amazing.
pleasure. My
Thank
pleasure.
you. And please send us your feedback and or questions to Legally Speaking at www.gabwa.org. That's www.gabwa.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Legally Speaking. Thank you.